Hello everyone and welcome to the Drydock episode 262. This week the questions are taken from guides 320 and 321, that's the East India Company ship Nemesis and USS Seawolf S197, so the World War II era one, and then the Wednesday videos on the USS North Carolina, that's the tour of USS North Carolina I did in April last year, and the follow-up with Admiral Henderson on the torpedoing of the North Carolina. So, let's begin. Josh Thomas Moore asks, which gun has the longer active service life, the British 15-inch 42 or the American 16-inch 50? Well, that's an interesting question with two possible answers. First, being easier, is just when did the first ship in question with that gun enter service, and when did the last ship with that gun exit service? And by that metric, it's incredibly easy to calculate because it's obviously going to be the 16-inch 50 because the last Iowas went out of commission, technically speaking, this century. But, of course, that career was punctuated by prolonged periods in reserve. So there's another way of working it out, which is how long were these guns actively in service, i.e. in active service vessels at sea? Now, you could be really picky and look at a specific vessel, but that's not really fair because, of course, we're talking about the gun, not the ship. So we have to take into account all time that the gun was in service, regardless of what ship it was on. Now, for the 15-inch 42, that's actually relatively easy because once it entered service for the first time on HMS Queen Elizabeth, it was in continuous service until Vanguard went into reserve for the final time. So HMS Queen Elizabeth commissioned at the end of 1914, so we might as well say, for sake of argument, that the gun's service starts at the beginning of 1915, and its continuous run in service ends when Vanguard goes into reserve at the end of 1955. Which means you're looking at about 41 years, give or take a couple of months, for the service life of the 15-inch 42. Now, for the 16-inch 50, of course, it's only mounted on the Iowas, so USS Iowa commissions at the beginning of 1943, so again, for sake of brevity, we'll just say start of 1943. And during their first commissions, the longest of the first commissions is actually the Missouri, which goes into reserve in February 1955, so we'll say beginning of 1955. The other three Iowas having gone into reserve before that, but that gives us a starting point of 12 years. But that decommissioning of Missouri overlaps with the second commissions of New Jersey, Iowa, and Wisconsin, and of those, the last to decommission in the 50s is Wisconsin, which goes in March 1958, so to our 12 years, we can add another 3, so we're up to 15 and a few months. Then nothing is in service post-1958 until USS New Jersey comes back online in 1968, and being generous, since she was in service for pretty much the entirety of 1969 and the bulk of 1968, we're going to say that's another 2 years, so that's 17 years. And then New Jersey is actually again our starting point for when they're all recommissioned during the 1980s. She's recommissioned at the very end of 1982, so we'll say start of 1983. And then Missouri, or as Ryan would say, Missouri, is the last to decommission at the beginning of 1992. So that's another 9 years effectively in service. So adding that 9 to our 17 gives us 26. So, give or take a few months, the 16-inch 50 is in active service with the US Navy for 26 years, which means that by active service career, the 15-inch 42 wins by a considerable margin, the 15-inch being in active service for about 58% longer than the 16-inch 50. But, of course, as I said at the beginning, if you count time in the naval reserves, i.e. when the ship theoretically could be reactivated and taken into service before it's completely taken off the naval register, of course that only adds 5 years to the 15-inch 42 until Vanguard is scrapped, which would make the 15-inch 42's total service run at 46 years, whereas if we go from the beginning of 1943 to 2006, which is when the last two Iowas were formally struck off of the register, that's 63 years. So, take your pick whether you want active service or theoretically possible to be in service. BK Zhong asks, would it have been theoretically possible to create some sort of horrible fusion between the Italian 15-inch gun, the American 16-inch 50, and the Japanese 18.1-inch to create an 18-inch gun that fires unusually heavy shells at incredibly high muzzle velocities, enough to compensate for the shell being a super heavy, thus resulting in superior belt penetration? Theoretically, yes. I mean, we know the US had actually developed and prototype tested an 18-inch gun, so given the normal spread of barrel lengths relative to caliber displayed by battleship guns, it's easily within the capabilities of, say, World War II America to produce an 18-inch 55 caliber weapon. And the reason I'm saying for the Americans to produce it is because, of course, they're the ones with the super heavy shells. So, of course, World War II America would produce a super heavy shell for their 18-inch gun. And, well, then you have an 18-inch 55 caliber weapon with a super heavy 18-inch shell. By the fact it's a 55 caliber weapon, it's probably already going to go pretty far. But then if you make the gun a little bit stockier than perhaps is average, especially in the breech area, and then, of course, you can sustain an even greater amount of charge, and of course your square cube law is going to be favouring you in this case because it's going to be an even bigger breech chamber anyway, at which point you could get that shell moving at a pretty impressive speed, and of course it being 55 calibers long is going to help quite a lot with that endeavour, albeit obviously the high muzzle velocity versus the super heavy shell is, somewhat counterproductive in terms of the general purpose of the super heavy shell, which was to enable better deck penetration. But as you said in your question, your main objective here is better belt penetration. So yeah, at that point you would have a super heavy 18-inch shell that would be absolutely booking it at, over 2,800 feet per second out of the muzzle, at which point, yeah, you really, really, really do not want to be hit by that thing. The Mole's Revenge asks, can you tell us more about what exactly led to Royal Navy warships firing on a British merchantman that then came under the protection of the Chinese at the start of the Opium Wars? So this requires a little bit of a speed run into the causes of the First Opium War. Obviously, China had a major problem with people getting addicted to opium. The British were quite happy to supply China huge amounts of opium because it made them a lot of money. And the Chinese weren't very happy with this, so they were trying to stamp out opium trade, rather understandably, at which point one of their commissioners had ordered everybody to sign a new bond or contract. So at the time, there were certain authorized Chinese merchants who could deal with foreign merchants, and they and foreign merchants had to sign up to basically a agreed code of conduct. The new code of conduct included a line that basically said, if we catch any of you dealing with opium, then you'll be sentenced to death. So, fairly strict rules. But there were two lines of thought in British concerns at the time. The industrial bloc, if you like, so some of the bigger traders obviously just wanted to make money, so they didn't want this to happen at all. And the British Superintendent of Trade, a chap called Charles Elliot, felt that banning anything was a violation of the principle of free trade, almost regardless of what it was, even if it was an incredibly destructive drug. Their attitude was, well, that's something for internal matters to be dealt with, but you shouldn't stop us selling it. Which is one of those absolutist positions which sounds great in principle, the free trade should not be impeded by anything. And then you come up to things like, well, in that regard, we demand the right to sell you hard drugs, which, somewhat sours the noble principle of free trade. And as a result, Elliot went to the lengths of actually banning British merchant ships and their owners from signing up to the new Chinese rules. He said, no, we're as a collective organisation, we're not going to accept this. No one's allowed to sign these things. The Chinese retaliated by refusing to sell any British merchant ships food and other provisions. Elliot responded by forcing the issue at gunpoint. And then, of course, you had another fly in the ointment, which was that not every British ship, contrary to some popular opinions, was dealing in opium. There were a fair number of British ships that just wanted to deal in regular trade goods for various reasons. Some of them just couldn't be bothered. Some of them didn't sail in the right areas to pick up opium. And others, like a ship that was owned and operated by Quakers, refused to deal with opium on religious grounds. And this Quaker-captained vessel came into port and essentially believed that the British commissioner, that being Elliot, had exceeded his authority by forbidding everyone from signing up to this. So you had this slightly absurd position of Elliot claiming to defend free trade by saying, you have to let us sell opium to everybody that we want or else. And then this Quaker captain, who amongst his reasoning was, well, by refusing to let us sign up a document to not trade in something we weren't trading in anyway, thus preventing us from trading in China at all, Elliot is actually preventing free trade. So to enable free trade, we must disobey his decision, which is ostensibly to protect free trade. Anyway, so they did that, and they were quite happy trading in the other goods that they'd brought, and the Chinese were quite happy with that as well. And then Elliot saw this and thought, almost like union negotiating rules, this is a break in the collective front that British merchantmen, supposedly all obeying his command, are presenting. And so he didn't want other British ships rolling in and going, yep, sure, we'll sign up to the no opium trade clause, just let us trade our normal stuff, because then Elliot felt that might normalise the idea of signing it, which, as we said, he didn't want anyone to do. And so in response, Elliot ordered a blockade of one of the Chinese ports, not to stop the Chinese trading outwards, but to stop British ships coming in and trading when he didn't want them to. At which point the Royal Saxon, another merchant ship, showed up, and it was perfectly willing to trade with the Chinese without dealing in opium, at which point Elliot opened fire on the Royal Saxon, at which point the Chinese went, but this is a ship we want to trade with, and these are the people we don't want to trade with, because they're trying to force us to deal in opium. So the Chinese sent out their own warships to protect the British merchant ship, which was under attack from British warships trying to stop it not trading in opium with the Chinese. Yeah, the Opium War is a very convoluted and rather silly thing, which at some point I should probably do a video on, but, it's conspiracy board levels of complicated. Matt G asks, are there hundreds or even thousands of unexploded torpedoes just laying around on the ocean floor? And do fishing trawlers ever pull them up or set them off? Yes, there are, but exactly where and what status they're in varies quite considerably. So there are, in, say, somewhere like the North Sea, quite a lot of torpedoes that were expended in World War I and World War II without hitting anything. And yes, they do occasionally wash up, or trawlers pull them up, etc., etc. They generally don't tend to explode just by being hauled up, although they are, in many cases at least, partially still viable, so they do have to be dealt with by ordnance disposal teams. But when you're talking about the deeper oceans, well, yeah, there probably are some torpedoes, 3-4 plus kilometers down, but it depends on the method in which the torpedo deals with itself once it's missed, because some torpedoes do actually have a self-destruct, so they're supposed to explode if they don't after a certain distance. But that's relatively rare. Most torpedoes either just don't have any kind of self-destruct mechanism, they'll just coast until they take on enough water to sink, or they have an quote-unquote auto-destruct mechanism, which is basically they reach the end of their run and then they fill with water specifically, deliberately, and then sink. Which, of course, means that if they are descending, thousands of feet down, pressure builds up, and depending on how much air is still inside them at the time, they may implode. So, depending on the torpedo type and depending on its self-sinking mechanism, if any, it is quite likely that there are lots of expended Long Lances and Mark 14s and so forth littering the Pacific seabed, but compared to the number that were misses and then sank, there won't be as many as compared to somewhere like the North Sea, the English Channel, etc., because a number of them will have imploded and been scattered to the four winds, or the four currents, I guess, underwater, just by sheer pressure. And the same thing will apply in the Atlantic to a certain extent. Obviously, torpedoes that were fired off of the coastal shelf or above the coastal shelf will probably still be intact, whereas ones that were fired above the abyssal plain, they may still be there, but there's a good chance they're also in bits. Wayne's World of SciTech asks, could you give a short explanation as to why the Seawolf is or isn't a fleet sub as compared to previous or later classes? So whether you regard the Seawolf, which is a Sargo class submarine, as a fleet submarine or a proper fleet submarine, really depends on where you draw the line as to what defines a fleet submarine. I'd say you can look at it from two sets of characteristics. The very basic characteristics, or what I would call the practical characteristics. By the very basic characteristics it is, and by the more practical characteristics it's not quite. And then that honour would actually go to the Tambor class, which is the Sargo class's immediate successors. Now the reason for that is if you want the absolute basic minimum for a fleet submarine, you want long range, which the Sargos have, about 11,000 miles at surface cruising speed, and you want them to be able to keep up with a battle fleet, which they can do at 21 knots. Obviously, this being the US battle line made up of standard class battleships. And other than that, they're submarines, they're armed with torpedoes. That's the very basic definition of a fleet sub. However, whilst they do tick that box, and indeed so do the Salmon class, which are very, very similar immediately preceding them, the Porpoise class before them don't, because apart from anything, they're only capable of 18 knots on the surface. The reason why, in more practical definitions, I don't think the Sargos quite tick that box is two reasons. One, if you're going to go long distances and you're going to be travelling at high speeds, you probably want a reliable power plant. And let's just say the Sargos collectively do not have that. Towards the end of the Sargo build run, they are beginning to get a relatively decent, reliable power plant, but for most of them, that system would be very problematic going forward. And I mean, when I did one of the videos about Pearl Harbour, I mentioned, there were some of these subs actually en route to Pearl Harbour, and one of the main problems they were having was faulty engines. I think, in fact, that was the start of the US Navy submarine campaign videos. So if you want a fleet sub, you've got to have a reliable power plant, and by and large the Sargos don't have that. The other thing is firepower. If you're going to be, theoretically at least, given we're ticking the box of fleet submarine, going up against an enemy battle fleet, you want to be able to fire a decent spread of torpedoes, or you want to be able to fire some torpedoes and have some in reserve if you need to update your firing solution, or you need to fire at another target. And whilst both the Sargos and the Tambors carry the same number of torpedoes, 24, the layout is slightly different. So the Sargos have 4 torpedo tubes forward and 4 torpedo tubes aft, so the maximum they can fire is 4 at any one target. Now, 4 torpedoes is, in most cases, going to be more than enough to take down an enemy if you hit them, but of course the chances of every torpedo from a salvo actually hitting the target are very, very slim. It does happen very occasionally in the Second World War, but not very often. So you're going to miss with some, and if you miss with, say, half, then you're going to hit with 2, which, given typical hit rates, 1 or 2 torpedoes on a big enemy target like a battleship or carrier, that's damage, that's not kill. Whereas if you look at the Tambors, they still have 4 aft tubes, but they have 6 forward tubes. And, hitting with 3 torpedoes, 3 torpedoes might very well either sink a fairly large target, or it's going to cripple it bad enough that you can reload and finish it off with another spread. And this 6 forward, 4 aft torpedo tube setup is pretty much repeated during all subsequent US fleet submarines after the Tambor class. So the Sargos are almost there, but not quite. Arakishi Kishi asks, how many people would work in a turret? Would it be, say, 2 per gun barrel, or would there be more, like another one on the rangefinder? And would battleships fabricate parts for ships in the fleet, like a broken oil pump? In terms of part fabrication, yes, battleships and aircraft carriers, which obviously had the most extensive machine shops, would at times fabricate parts for other ships in the fleet, which perhaps had something broken, which the bigger machine shops could provide, but the smaller ones couldn't. But in terms of how many people would work in a turret, that is very much a moving target, because, as you can see here with a King George V, you might have a twin turret, you might have a triple turret, which is not seen here, or you might have a quad turret, so that's going to change the number of men, and also the size of the gun is going to change the number of men. Plus, there's also this whole thing of, do you count the turret crew as just the people in the gun house, the bit that you can see here, or do you also count the people in the working chamber, which is in some designs directly below the gun house? Do you count the people working in the magazines and the shell rooms, etc., etc.? All of this can add up quite a bit. And then the number of people is going to be split down by a number of different roles. So you'll have a gun crew for each gun. And that varies depending on the Navy. Not by a huge amount, but it can differ by, you have an average and you might be plus or minus 1 or 2 on that. And then you have people working on the rangefinder and fire control unit within the turret, if that turret has it. And then you have an overall gun turret captain and his crew, etc. So, for example, if you look at the crew of a 12-inch turret in the Royal Navy in World War I, there would be 2 gun layers and 1 gun trainer. So whether you have a single turret, twin turret, triple turret, quadruple turret, that's probably going to be the same, although you might have an extra gun layer in a triple turret and so forth. So maybe 1 gun layer per gun, or you might just have the 2, depending, again, if you're looking at a turret that can elevate its guns individually, you probably want gun layers for each gun. If you're looking at a turret where all the guns go up and down together, like an early standard class, then you probably can just make do with a fixed number. Anyway, you've also got 4 sight setters, obviously, depending on how many sights you have in the turret, sighting hoods, etc., etc. You then have the captain of the turret and his backup, so those are going to be the same pretty much in any turret. Then for the 12-inch gun, you have 2 gun crews of 5 men each, so they're the ones who are actually handling the shells and the charges going into the gun turret, or into the guns themselves. Now, obviously, if you have a 12-inch triple, you just have 5 additional men for that particular role, but in a larger vessel, like a ship armed with a 16-inch gun, you might have 1 or 2 additional men on the gun crew, and on something like HMS Belfast with 6-inch guns, you might have 1 or 2 men less. And then you get the magazine crew, the shell room crew, a general purpose control party who are there in part to absorb casualties, etc., etc. So a triple 6-inch turret on HMS Belfast has 27 sailors per turret in the actual gun house, and then another 22 down below sending up shells and charges. And then in a 16-inch turret, on the Royal Navy, you have generally a few more men than on average. On an Iowa-class battleship turret, for example, if we're just talking again about the gun house and not talking about further down in the magazines, you have 4 men per gun, as opposed to the 5 that you had on the 12-inch in British practice. But their command crew is slightly larger. You've got 6 men, and then you've got 9 men on the sights and rangefinders, so you've got a slightly different balance. So in that case, if you've got 6 plus 9 in your command and rangefinding fire control computer roles, so you've got 15 there, and then you've got 4 per gun, well, 3 guns in an Iowa-class turret, so that's 12 plus your 15, so it's 27 men. So in actual fact, in an Iowa's 16-inch 50 turret, There's actually exactly the same number of men as you'd find in Belfast's 6-inch triple, but if you go in a Royal Navy 16-inch turret like Nelson class, you'll find a few more men. So not only does it vary turret by turret, but it also varies nation by nation. Gary Dubose asks, when fleets were approaching each other in good weather, how far apart would they be when they first made visual contact? How realistic was it to actually hit something at this range? And also, how close would they need to be in order for a hit from a battleship to be a virtual certainty? With the last question, it depends extremely heavily on era and also to a certain extent on the training for the ship. Because if you're talking, say, 1895, you could be 500 yards away and still miss. Whereas if you're in, say, 1942 and you're on USS Washington under the command of Admiral Lee and you're 9,000 yards away, you've got to have a very good excuse for not hitting. And so on and so forth. Plus, there's just a certain degree of natural inaccuracy because, for example, in 1943, so just over a year actually after Admiral Lee killed Kirishima, you have Duke of York, which gets Scharnhorst dead to rights at 12,000 yards. Now, on paper, that's at pretty much point-blank range, but at 12,000 yards, the dispersal of shells is already enough that in reasonably poor weather, which is what Duke of York was facing Scharnhorst in, you will hit, which Duke of York did, but you're not going to hit with every shell. And stretch that back and forth as you will. So unfortunately, there is no given how close do you need to be to get at least one guaranteed hit, because it's varying even in good weather, depending on the technology available to the fleet, which depends on the time period that you're looking at, even within the time period the channel covers. However, in terms of the other two elements of the question, how far apart could they be when they first made visual contact? Well, that's limited by the curvature of the Earth, but approximately speaking, assuming that you're working from the tallest rangefinder on a battleship, and you're spotting the masts and possibly the other rangefinder on your opposing number, i.e. the tops of the masts on the enemy battleship, you're talking something in the order of between 30 and 35 miles, depending on the exact height of your rangefinder and the exact height of the enemy masts. But at 30 to 35 miles, how realistic is it to actually hit something? Near enough impossible. So for one thing, if you take the sort of the median value, 32.5 miles, you're talking over 57,000 yards. There's precious little on the sea in terms of naval gunnery that will reach that far. And at that point, you're aiming at a few tops of masts, so your accuracy, even if you had a gun that could reach that far, would be hideously terrible. But as I said, even exceptionally long-range guns for World War II on ships would still be usually falling 10,000 or more yards short at maximum elevation, so you're not hitting, basically. And as I mentioned before, realistically speaking, if the enemy ship is undertaking evasive action, once you get much beyond 28 to 30,000 yards, your hitting is actually relying more on luck and you being inaccurate with your fire control solution, assuming your opponent is awake, because anything at or above that kind of distance, assuming your opponent evades at the flash of your guns, they will mathematically be out of your circular area of probability for the average battleship's shell splash group, assuming that your fire control solution was right in the first place. Of course, they could evade, and it could turn out by sheer happenstance that they evade into an area where your shots are actually landing because you're a terrible shot, and they get hit, but you're not going to be able to rely on that in any way, shape or form. Vicky asks, why weren't barrage balloons used much or at all to help protect ships at sea from air attack in World War II? Well, there are several reasons. Obviously, as you can see here off the beaches at D-Day, they were used on occasion, but there are a couple of big reasons and a few minor reasons. One of the minor reasons is, they take up a fair bit of space and they do impose a little bit of drag on the ship, assuming you're talking about a warship out at open sea, which could cost it in speed. And if they're facing a surface threat, or even, to be honest, an air threat, a big silver balloon floating over you is kind of a big marker of, hey, I'm over here, whereas otherwise you might be able to evade. But the larger issues come from the fact that the barrage balloon doesn't do a huge amount to protect the target itself, because obviously it's either hovering over the target, or if the ship's motoring along at 25-30 knots, it's slightly behind the target. That doesn't actually stop a torpedo bomber from lining up on you and dropping its torpedo. 99% of the time, torpedo bombers don't do the Hollywood thing of roaring straight over the ship they've just dropped a torpedo on. They tend to break away at a distance, at which point the barrage balloon, as I said, has done nothing more than just highlight where you are and slightly slow you down, which makes you a slightly easier target. What barrage balloons do is they make it awkward for low-lying attackers to fly through the area. So if you're talking about a massed fleet formation, like say the D-Day landings, especially where you have not just ships but also artificial harbours and troops to protect, then a mass of barrage balloons makes a certain amount of sense, because again, it's not going to necessarily protect that individual ship, but it's going to disrupt the ability of the enemy, in theory at least, to attack other parts of the formation, or in this case troops on land. And to achieve that, you have to achieve a critical density of balloons for it to have any effect. And even when you look at what are, in naval terms, are relatively compact anti-aircraft formations, you're still talking about spacing between ships of, thousands of yards or whole miles, at which point, even if every ship in, say, a defensive circle in 1943 in the Pacific was each carrying a barrage balloon, there would be more than enough space between the ships for aircraft to operate pretty much unimpeded, with perhaps maybe closing off a single attack vector for dive bombers, which, again, is just not really worth all the effort. Now, in theory, a slightly more closely packed formation, like a convoy, for example, might have a small amount of utility for barrage balloons against attack from something like, say, a Condor. But when you compare the frequency and lethality of Condor attacks versus the frequency and lethality of U-boat attacks, the U-boats are the much greater threat. And again, if you're a U-boat captain and you stick your periscope above the water, if a convoy is 15 miles away, you might not see it. If a convoy is 15 miles away and they're hoisting a bunch of barrage balloons, you might see the balloons. So, on balance, it's better to not have them and hopefully evade a few U-boats than it is to have them and attract more U-boats and maybe slightly inconvenience some Condors. So, it's essentially, ships at sea just don't present a clustered enough set of targets to make a barrage balloon set worthwhile, unless you're doing something like a mass amphibious assault. Mike Roach, or Mike Roch, maybe, asks, if the torpedo that hit USS North Carolina didn't pierce the inner hull, how did it kill the sailors below deck? Were they in the void spaces? Were they in normal crew quarters and rattled around so violently they died from blunt force trauma, or something else? So there are a number of ways, unfortunately, to die from a torpedo hit that doesn't actually penetrate the interior of the ship. And I'll be referring to ways more broadly, and some of these will apply to the men on North Carolina. So, for example, on Bismarck, when she was hit amidships by swordfish torpedoes, they didn't penetrate the inner defences of Bismarck, but she still suffered a casualty because the transmitted shock of the impact in the local area was enough to throw a man who was within the hull and therefore not in a position to be flooded out, but threw him off his feet and into a bulkhead hard enough that the impact killed him. So transmitted shock is, can either directly kill someone if it's intense enough, or if it's slightly less intense, it can throw them into something hard enough that then that blunt force trauma will kill them. But it was also noted that in some of the compartments where men were recovered, they had hair burnt off. Now, as Admiral Henderson pointed out, the reports of fire within the magazines and smoke were probably a little bit over-enthusiastic, but some of the casualties a lot closer to the event were found with their hair burnt away by flash. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that the torpedo necessarily penetrated the inner hull, but you can have, in very high energy situations, flash being generated by other things. So really, really violent shock can actually cause not spontaneous combustion of the air, because there is a specific cause for it, but it can cause even the air to combust. I mean, you see that basically when something moves fast enough that the air can't get out of the way in time, you get heat, and then eventually you get fire, more accurately plasma. Shuttle re-entry, for example, or a MiG-31 or an SR-71 traveling at really, really, really high speeds. Plus, of course, you can get other things inside that are burnt up or caused to flash into combustion by the energy imparted from the shock itself. So paint, for example, is combustible. Put enough energy into that, that'll burn off, and so on and so forth. So shock and flash, and also shrapnel, because you might not have the hull penetrated, but you might have spalling that might send fragments flying into the ship and through unfortunate crewmen. With the majority of the sailors of North Carolina, though, I believe it was transmitted shock. Galbear asks, from each navy through World War II onwards, which ship could you see having a swimming pool besides HMS Bristol? Well, for the US, it's pretty easy because we have USS New Jersey, which actually had a swimming pool or two converted from an old 40mm gun tub, as you can see here. As far as the Russian Navy goes, I don't think you're really going to see swimming pools on most Russian Navy ships, because apart from anything, if you're in the Baltic or the North Sea, an external swimming pool is just going to be an ice rink pretty soon in most circumstances. Obviously, in the summer in the Baltic, or perhaps in the Black Sea, you might have some. Albeit, I vaguely recall something saying that the Typhoon-class submarines had swimming pools aboard them. So, maybe that. And in theory, any ship that belonged to a navy where that ship was a legacy item from World War II probably had multiple 40mm Bofors mounted on them at some point. So, there is a reasonable chance that, at least as long as they lasted, cruisers at the very least, and ships of approximately that size might well have done similar conversions to what USS New Jersey did, or sometimes it's known that they strung tubs they strung tarpaulins to make a kind of swimming pool type tub. And then later on some ships, I suppose there'd be pits where limbo and squid or equivalent anti-submarine mortar thrower systems were that had been taken out you could use. I've always thought it would be absolutely spectacular. There's so many ways you could use it, but one of the rather interesting ways you could do something would be you could have a surface level swimming pool using the hangar at the back of a Des Moines class cruiser, because there's a massive platform that raises and lowers. So in theory, either you could waterproof, and it probably already is waterproof actually, the interior hangar, lower the platform and just fill it with water, which create a very deep pool, but probably cause all sorts of leakage issues, and the ship would probably sit quite heavily by the stern. Or if you wanted to be slightly less ambitious, you could build up a basic framework on the platform, and then, maybe 6 foot, 8 foot tall, and then just lower it and freeze the platform 6 or 8 foot down, fill it with water, and then you have an easy access but quite deep pool, which might not weigh the ship down quite as much. Vinve asks, we often hear about bad Army-Navy relationships like World War II-era Japan, but what were the best Army-Navy and Air Force-Navy relationships during the period the channel covers, and how did these good relations help the services? Well, there's always going to be a degree of inter-service rivalry, I suspect. I don't think there's ever been a period where you could say that either the Army and the Navy or the Air Force and the Navy have gotten on absolutely 100% perfectly like a house on fire. But there have been periods where various armed services have been perhaps a bit more appreciative of each other than otherwise. So, I mean, a lot of it is forced by circumstance. So, for example, when at the very end of the period the Channel covers in the Korean War, when the various Allied forces were being pushed back very quickly by first the North Korean advance and then later by the Chinese advance, they were exceptionally appreciative of direct fire support missions from cruisers, battleships, and destroyers offshore from the Navy, and of course naval airstrikes, which obviously that engenders quite a lot of camaraderie. And similarly, whilst there was a mistaken impression at the Dunkirk evacuations that the RAF wasn't doing anything, they were just doing it inland and away from the beaches. There was obviously a certain degree of appreciation between the Army and the Navy, because the Navy was coming in to help the Army and take them all home. During some parts of the Age of Sail, the relationship between the Army and the Navy in things like the Spanish Navy and the British Navy worked reasonably well, and in other decades it didn't work particularly well. But a lot of that is that in the early part of the Age of Sail, the presence of soldiers aboard a ship was pretty much a necessity, because boarding and counterboarding was the order of the day. And latterly, especially for the Royal Navy, using the British Army as the land forces but transported by the Navy forced a certain degree of compliance and working together. But in terms of air forces, I mean, towards the end of World War II, Air Force cooperation with the nations that still had navies left had obviously improved just due to war practice, but at the beginning of their respective entries into World War II, well, of course, the Japanese Army and Navy hated each other. There wasn't a separate Japanese Air Force. The Regia Marina and the Regia Aeronautica didn't really talk to each other that much. Goering famously absolutely wanted to be in charge of absolutely anything that flew, and then, support from the Kriegsmarine and the Luftwaffe was not the best. Although later on, when the Condor flights and everything got going, there was a certain amount of decent work between the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine. The RAF famously, really didn't talk to the Navy all that much until, although ostensibly they were supposed to, until, well, things like the Channel Dash showed that you really, really, really had to. And in the Pacific, again, similarly at the start of World War II for the US Army Air Force and the US Navy didn't have the best working ethic together. You'd have random flights of B-17s popping up trying to level bomb Japanese shipping. The US Navy basically didn't really know they were coming a lot of the time. They just like, oh, those look like B-17s. Well, I hope they recognise which ships are which. Obviously, there was some communication, but again, not particularly brilliant communication. Dr. D.M. Platt asks, could the Queen Elizabeth-class battleships have been rebuilt in the 1930s with small tube boilers? And if so, how might that have improved their performance if the same number of boilers had been used, if the same amount of horsepower was maintained? Well, the short answer is 3 of them were. Warspite, Queen Elizabeth, and Valiant obviously all have received new machinery using small tube boilers, which took up less space, but the objective of those refits was to broadly maintain the power output, and the savings in weight were put towards improving protection and firepower. Now, they did end up slightly heavier than they had been going in, so the power output, because the ships actually came out at, depending on the ship, either near enough the same speed they went in or maybe just a fraction faster. And so the power output was also just a fraction more than what they'd had previously, but using 1,500-ish tons plus or minus a bit. Less weight and less volume of machinery, and Malaya and Barham also had their machinery refitted. Now, if you look at the plans of the engine spaces before and after, and the boiler spaces as well, with the machinery spaces, i.e. the engines, the turbines, those don't get any smaller, because whilst the turbines themselves could get a bit smaller, there was more complex reduction gearing, so overall that didn't change. But when you look at the overall take-up of boiler space, that you could probably, especially given the fact they completely compartmentalized the boiler rooms, if you'd gone with the original rather more open layout and done a little bit of squeezing, you could probably have gotten another couple of boilers in. Now, given that the 6 boilers that were refitted, the 6 small tube boilers, gave about 80,000 shaft horsepower versus the 75,000 that the previous 24 boilers had, then roughly speaking, if you included 2 extra boilers, you could get up to about 106,000 shaft horsepower, which makes a sense because, an 8 3-drum boiler set was also what they stuck in the King George V, and that generated 110,000 shaft horsepower. So, the 106,000 estimate was based purely on just taking the stated output of the Queen Elizabeth refit power plant, divide by 6, multiply through by 8. So essentially you're looking at sticking a King George V power plant into a Queen Elizabeth class hull. Displacement-wise, the Queen Elizabeths, even in their refit state, still do displace a little bit less than King George V, but they are a little bit shorter as well. So, you might get them up to, with their bulges and everything, you might get them up to 26, maybe 27 knots, but I don't think you'll quite match 28 knots plus of the King George V's, purely because of the slightly different hull form, especially with the bulges. Maybe without the bulges you might. This is why the Italians, when they stuck a bunch of power into their dreadnoughts, they ended up putting on a bow extension to help with that. The thing you've got to remember about Jellicoe saying, well, small tube boilers could have got the QEs up to 28 knots in the 1910s is that, of course, the QEs had a very different hull form and a lot less going on in terms of upper works and additional armour and so forth back then, and therefore, a given amount of power would get them through the water faster as compared to post-refit. But you've also got to consider that if you were going to completely fill the original machinery spaces with new boilers, well, then the stuff that went in place of some of the old boilers would have to go elsewhere, at which point, if the Royal Navy did have the money to do such a refit, and, and the intention of doing so, then they almost certainly would have stuck on a bow extension or something like that, if for nothing else, just to provide the storage space elsewhere. And then you quite easily could have seen a QE motoring on at 28 knots. Dave Collier asks, can you tell us why King Alfred the Great is sometimes considered to have founded the English Navy and thereby the Royal Navy? It seems to be based on the romantic view of Alfred, as he was far from unique in leaders organising a group of ships for defence. The main difference between Alfred and other kings and leaders in that time period seems to be that, for the most part, other, at least English kings and leaders, because bear in mind, obviously, at this point, England is divided into multiple kingdoms, if they had a fleet at all, it was basically whatever ships were to hand. So shipbuilding was basically a private enterprise, and if any of the king's subjects happened to have some ships, when the king said, right, we need to all club together and go out in some ships and deal with people, then that's what they had. Or occasionally maybe the king would commission the building of a few ships for himself, but it would be part of a composite fleet, mostly made up of other people's ships, kind of like when the Spanish Armada showed up, actually, where the Royal Navy proper constituted maybe 20 to 25% of the overall strength of the English fleet, and everything else was privately owned. Whereas Alfred, decided as an objective matter of policy that he was going to oppose the Norse raids at sea, as opposed to waiting for them to land without much opposition and then trying to fight them on land. And B, he actually set out to build ships specifically for the purposes of war, built a fleet of them, and then used, his fleet under his direction to specifically fight naval actions, which kind of makes them a naval service, because bearing in mind the Royal Navy originally takes its name from the fact that they were the personal possessions of the monarch, rather than a national fleet per se, in the way that some other nations' navies have always belonged to the state, rather than as personal property of the king, queen, emperor, empress, whatever you want to call them. And so before Alfred, there isn't really a purpose-built war fleet as such that's maintained for any particular length of time. And so in some ways this is then seen as the start of the Royal Navy, although its strength as a fighting force, as personal property of the king, would obviously wax and wane quite considerably during the next few hundred years up until the Tudor period. Sebastian asks, if you were on a battleship of your choosing, would you rather take several 16-inch shell hits or a single long-lance torpedo hit, and which would be more survivable? Well, obviously, battleship of my choosing, I'd go for a late era design with a lot of decent torpedo defense. So HMS Vanguard is pictured here, but you could take, well, Yamato. I mean, okay, her torpedo defense is flawed, but she has the advantage of just sheer mass. The Iowa torpedo defense system is also a little bit flawed, but again, it's quite a big ship. So, whatever. Any very large, above treaty weight limit World War II era battleship will probably do to varying degrees. And the reason I'd always want to take a long lance hit is because, well, if a long lance hit hits outside of my torpedo protection system, i.e. the bow or the stern, the amount of flooding it's going to do is not going to be enough to sink me. And all of the treaty breaker, if you like, ships, so, Littorio, Bismarck, Vanguard, Yamato, Iowa, whatever, either through mass or good anti-torpedo defense systems or a combination of the two, if they take a hit where it might otherwise matter, where magazines, machinery spaces, etc., their torpedo defense systems are fairly likely to absorb most or all of the impact of a single long lance hit. And even what flooding might result if the system is somehow breached can be contained and the ship can limp away. Whereas, if you're being hit by, say, half a dozen 16-inch shells, that could be from all sorts of ranges, it could be from all sorts of angles, and it's going to hit all sorts of different places, which could significantly more compromise the ship, potentially, and also every time you're rolling a dice. So, again, most of the ships that I just listed should stand up to a 16-inch shell hit or two, but some of them, their armour will have weaknesses to 16-inch shell hits at certain ranges and angles. And as I said, you every time you're rolling a dice, so, the first hit, sure, it might just blow up part of your secondary armament, not massively impeding your fighting efficiency. Another hit might take out a funnel. Okay, fine, that's a problem for your funnel, but just drop your speed a bit, but you're still okay. Giulia Cesare being hit by Warspite, for example. But you might also get a hit to the turret or to the barbette, and roll the dice. Where exactly is that going to go? Could that cause flash and ammunition fires? Could something maybe hit just below the secondary mounts and set off some of your secondary ready-use ammunition or your secondary magazines? Could something dive low and potentially cause some kind of problem lower down? Could it come in from an extremely long range and potentially pierce the deck armour? You're rolling an awful lot more dice with those scenarios than you are with the long lance, which most of the time is going, 95% of the time is going to be survivable when you're limiting it to a single hit. If it was a single 16-inch shell hit, then sure, I'd rather take my chances with that because, air in the top is less dangerous than water in the bottom. But once you're up to several, there's too many chances, I think. Donovan Lawler asks, at one point in my youth, I got gifted a picture Encyclopedia of the World's Battleships from 1850 to 1950. I don't remember the name of said book. Sadly, it disappeared during a move. I'm wondering if you know it, or at least have a good recommendation for a replacement. Well, of course, the thing is, I don't know how old you are, so that puts publication date at a bit of an opening. But, I mean, the thing is, encyclopedias of the world's battleships covering that wide a time period, they are actually relatively difficult to come by because, for example, Conway's All the World's Fighting Ships, well, it's not just battleships, it's all ships, but to cover the 1850 to 1950 period, that thing takes up 3 volumes, so it's probably not that. this one that's being pictured at the moment, the World Encyclopedia of Battleships, it's been through several reprintings. That does cover pretty much the period you're talking about, and it's by Peter Hoare. The first edition came out in 2007, I think. So potentially, I mean, good grief, 2007 was 16 years ago. So, again, not without knowing what your age is, could it maybe have been that one? It's quite a big thing as well. I've got a copy floating around somewhere, an original one. You've got Oscar Parks's British Battleships 1860 to 1950, but one, that's British, not world battleships, and two, that's not really a picture encyclopedia, whereas Peter Hoare's one is. There's also Conway's Battleships, the definitive visual reference to the world's all big gun ships. That's got some really nice illustrations in it. That came out in 2008, but that picks up at Dreadnought. It doesn't go back to 1850 or 1860. So yeah, I would say the Peter Hoare book is probably your only best bet for a world encyclopedia with lots of pictures that covers that massive time period. The other one that I would recommend, though, if you can't find or get hold of that one, would be this one, Fighting Ships 1850 to 1950 by Sam Willis. Rather excellent chap, by the way, but also a very good book. And it although it does cover not just battleships, but other vessels as well. So, yeah, that would be an alternative in my suggestion. I mean, obviously, you could also splash out and try and find all 3 volumes of Conway's All the World's Fighting Ships for the period, but, well, I don't know what your budget is. Chipster8253 asks, you discuss the process whereby heavily damaged ships are triaged and how they're repaired, but I'm fascinated by the Pearl Harbour survivors and the immense refits they underwent, specifically West Virginia, California, Tennessee, and Nevada, although Nevada wasn't an extreme refit compared to the other 3. Could you expound on the process behind the massive refits and the engineering and physics needed to pull off the said refits? And finally, do you have any insight on the US Navy's decision to perform those refits, the cost versus the economic benefit, and the time, manpower, resources, etc. taken up? Well, you're in luck because, although obviously it's impossible to tabulate all of that in a 5-minute response to a Drydock question, in keeping with my tradition of doing something related to Pearl Harbour that is not a video on the actual attack itself every early December, this year I'm aiming for, well, a video, but as with the Pearl Harbour Salvage series it may turn into several, about the reconstructions of the ships that were salvaged and or towed away from Pearl Harbour. So you'll get at least an hour, possibly more content going into all of the stuff you asked for in extreme detail. Now, for the minute, in terms of the question that you've asked for this Drydock, the process is essentially a bit of a hybrid one. So back before Pearl Harbour, there was a modernization program in place for the so-called Big Five, the Tennessees and Colorados. Now, as with most proposed modernization programs, that had several different tiers, starting from obviously the most ambitious, complete rebuild modernization, all the way down to a relatively basic one. Now, before the war broke out, or at least before Pearl Harbour happened, there had been plans in place to refit and modernize those ships. Colorado missed Pearl Harbour precisely because she was in dock beginning her refit, albeit that the refit option that had been decided upon was not the bare bones minimum, but it was closer to that than the full refit of all the proposals that had been selected. And that's one of the reasons why, when you look at Colorado in the late war period, she looks substantially less advanced than, say, something like West Virginia, because, well, okay, fair enough, she was a little bit rushed out the door to get a ship back in service, but essentially what you're looking at with Colorado is pretty much within a few features here or there what the plan was for the refit ships. Once war started and once it became clear what the extent of the damage was to some of the Pearl Harbour vessels that had been salvaged, and of course the rather greater appreciation for air attack as a threat, they went back to the drawing board and they went, okay, well, here is what we were planning to do. Where's the maximal version of that? And then we're going to hybridize that with the lessons we've learned and other opportunities that we hadn't considered in our final refits of these ships. So, for example, one of the bigger decisions that was taken, which was not something that would have played ball before the Pearl Harbor attacks, was the decision to bulge a lot of the ships up to a breadth whereby they could no longer get through the Panama Canal, because if you're making these refit decisions in peacetime, you want the utility of getting through the canal. Once you've had like the whole side of West Virginia blown out by multiple torpedo impacts, suddenly you care slightly less about the Panama Canal and slightly more about making sure that doesn't happen to the ship again. And of course, you know, the pre-war estimates for anti-aircraft gun refits, whilst they did include 5-inch 38s, would have included at best 50 cals and quad 1.1 inch, and by the time the Pearl Harbor refits were done, that's more like 20mm and 40mm. So essentially what you could describe the bigger Pearl Harbor refits as, it would be taking the maximal pre-war modernization refit proposals, adding massive bulges and updating it for the current air threat and the current anti-aircraft weapons available. Plus, of course, obviously things like radar, etc., that advanced whilst the ships were under repair. So it's an evolution of the maximal pre-war stuff. But, as I said, we will see that in a lot more detail somewhere in early December this year, with any luck. And that's it for this episode of the Drydock, everybody. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you again in another video coming up soon.